Hello and welcome to the Half Court Press podcast. I'm Wilson Moore, the Nebraska basketball beat writer for the Omaha World-Herald. I am joined for the second time now by Jon Walker, Creighton beat writer. Jon, how are you doing?
Man, I'm good. We've had I kind of talked on last week's episode that the past couple of weeks have been a whirlwind with covering Oklahoma State football and then making the jump up to Omaha and jumping right into things. So I have yesterday was finally a day to breathe and to just kind of I went and kind of ventured around Omaha and yeah, it was good. It was good. How are you, Wilson?
I'm doing well. Yeah, about to hit the road this afternoon for Minnesota, my hometown of Minneapolis, which is also where Nebraska will play tomorrow night, Williams Arena. Not actually from Minneapolis. I'm from the suburbs, and it annoys me when other people like say they're from Chicago and they're not. So I need to hold myself to the same standards. So no, I'm from Minnetonka, Minnesota. Either way, I'll be headed to the Twin Cities tonight. And yeah, lots to talk about today. Lots to I think Creighton and Nebraska gave us plenty good and bad to kind of digest from that game. But first, just what are your you're coming off your first first week, first 2 weeks on the Creighton beat. What are
Yeah,
your
first week, first
first
week.
week? Okay, yeah, what perfect time and what are your impressions of this basketball team?
Yeah, no, I might have mentioned it last week. I can't remember. But I for sure I was on a podcast before the I-80 battle, which we've got to come up with a different name for that, right? Like we've got to come up with something cooler. Um, that's maybe next year. But I had said like this is a team that when they're making shots, I mean, there are few teams in the country that'll beat them. Because we know that the volume that Creighton wants to shoot. I mean, they're going to shoot at least 23s a game, sometimes double that, plus some. This is a team that if they're going to make shots, they're going to be a tough out for anybody in the country. And if not, then the Colorado State game happens. And we just kind of saw the I guess wherewithal of the Blue Jays on Sunday. When it came to that Nebraska game and the fact that they just shot so consistently. But I think they ended up shooting 40%, 35% from three. So, that's a really good game from deep for some teams. That's like what you would consider not the best day at the office for Creighton. And that kind of tells you everything you need to know about this team.
Yeah, and that number was higher in the first half too. I forget
Yeah.
exactly what that was. That was when Baylor Shireman couldn't miss this. This is a good transition into that Sunday game. Yeah, I mean, um, Baylor Shireman I thought was the best offensive player on the floor, at least for the first half of that game. I know you wrote about that last night. I mean, and just Creighton hit some shots. Nebraska was not great on defense, and Fred Hoiberg was pretty
Yeah.
adamant about that. But Creighton just made shots, and I agree with you. Like you said, they're not gonna um, you're from Nebraska's perspective, you're not gonna win a lot of games when your opponent shoots like that from behind the arc in the first half, and you're really not gonna win a lot of games when you're 2 for 22 um
Yeah.
from 3 point range. I think my quick math, Nebraska got outscored 42-6 on 3 pointers. I think 14-2 was what it was. And just I don't know how many teams have won a game in the past decade when you have that kind of disparity.
No, that's so tough unless you have, Rink Mass go for 30, and that's just not what happened.
Yeah.
Like you can't have Rick Mass go 3 for 11 with 9 points and go 2 for 22 from deep. Like that, you probably know more than anybody, obviously, but just my early impressions of this Nebraska team, like that is a recipe for disaster most nights for them, let alone against a team that jumped to number 10 in the AP, fourth in the net, fifth in Ken Palm, whatever ranking you want to throw out, they're for sure up there.
Yeah, and that was my impression of that game as that was going on. Nebraska, obviously Creighton was fantastic. but Nebraska really didn't play well to the point. Like, I don't think Nebraska beats Duquesne if it had played like it did
Yeah.
against Creighton. And yeah, I mean, the good point about Mast. He didn't do a whole lot. I think a lot of that was Ryan Kalkbrenner. That Kalkbrenner was huge on the defensive end, and it forced Nebraska to shoot 3 pointers.
Yeah.
Have when you have him, just patrolling the center of controlling the paint, protecting the rim, it forced Nebraska to shoot jump shots to uh, try to be competitive from the perimeter. And, there are plenty of factors in that. I think one of them was just Nebraska just was cold. It was just not Nebraska's day shooting the ball.
Yeah. Wilson, I've been wondering something, so let me get your opinion on it as somebody who follows Nebraska so closely. I think one of the things we talked about last week when Sam was on here, one of the things that was on my mind going into Sunday was, okay, Creighton, is usually circled on people's schedule. You talk about DePaul, like they're going to pack that place when Creighton comes to town, right? UConn, like they're a national contender, obviously, but like when Creighton comes to town, there's not a seat in that building. Um, so they're used to the pressure like this. Nebraska, like when was the last time Nebraska had a sold out crowd, a top 15 opponent coming in, and it just so happens to be their in-state rival? Because from my understanding, like they kind of went into last year as the underdog, rode that mentality, and just so happened to come out with a win, right? But do you think the pressure of, oh, we're off to a really hot start. We did win last year, sold out crowd. How much do you think that pressure, if at all, got to the Huskers?
That's an interesting point because I'm generally hesitant to attribute things we see physically to mental things, just because I think it's hard to kind of get in
Right.
someone's head. But I will say Nebraska seemed tight in the opening minutes. I think on the first offensive possession, Josiah Alec traveled at the top of the key, just kind of just kind of an uncharacteristic shuffled his feet when he got the ball. A minute or two later, Mass got to his spot, kind of center of the paint where he usually hits that jump hook and missed. So I definitely see where you're coming from. Nebraska seemed a little tight to start the game, and I mean maybe Creighton was a little bit too. There wasn't a whole lot of scoring in those first 3 or 4 minutes, but it definitely seemed like kind of a hesitant, tepid start from Nebraska, especially.
Yeah. And then obviously, the kind of big sequence, I feel like we just saw that snowball, the
Oh yeah.
frustrations, the back and forth. I think we saw that reach its, kind of climax, if you will, when Tominaga threw the ball at the end of the half and
Yeah.
the jump shot happens. Ashworth leans into it. That's a really frustrating moment. Two more free throws get tacked on for throwing the ball. And yeah, I just thought that was one of those moments where it was they like they are having a rough day and they know it is kind of what it seemed like.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that was, Tominaga throwing that ball. I thought that was just a frustrating half in general for
Yeah.
Nebraska, and that felt like the accumulation of a lot more than just that play where you think about that,
Yeah. Absolutely.
they were down 11 at that point, before the free throws. They were ready to go into the half down 11, which is not bad against Creighton. And then you think, they were 1 for 10 from three there. If Nebraska's 3 for 10 from three, which had plenty of open shots, that's a 5-point game to the number 15 team in the country at halftime. So I think that was just, a lot of frustration in there. And yeah, that, you know, Creighton still wins the game without those 4 free throws at the end. They won by 29, but that was a big, I thought, momentum shift. And then Fred Hoiberg was big after the game of he really didn't like Nebraska's first like 2 or 3 offensive possessions coming out of the second half, like between it was 15 there, and then I think right away Creighton got up to like 17-18 in the first minute, and just kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah, and that was, that was kind of the thing is you were within, or you as in Nebraska, you were in striking distance,
Yeah,
and that happens, and it just seems to slip a little bit further out of reach, and
yeah,
then exactly the second half started the way it did, and I think within the first 4 minutes of 4 or 5 minutes of the second half, Creighton expanded the lead to 20 plus, and it was like, okay, that
yeah,
is, that's it. Especially, when you can see the writing on the wall. Not many
yeah,
days is Nebraska going to finish 9% from beyond the arc
yeah,
and 34% overall. So just, a no good, very bad day that certain, I don't even know if I could pinpoint when it exactly started, if I'm being honest.
yeah,
It just seemed like you looked up and it was back and forth, back and forth. I think it was 23-22. They
yeah,
led, and then boom, Creighton rattled off 30 points in the last 8 minutes of that half, last 9 minutes of that half, or something like that. That'd probably be it. But I don't think there was like one moment where it was like, boom, the
yeah,
doors just got blown off. And I think
yeah,
that was probably the most surprising thing to me. I'm sure Nebraska was taken aback by that a little bit too. But yeah, I mean that's got to be one of those like daggers almost where you're in striking distance and then boom, all of a sudden you're nowhere close.
yeah, yeah. I think Nebraska was down one with 8:54 left in the first half, and I was
Hmm.
impressed with the way Nebraska hung with Creighton through those first 10 minutes. I remember thinking around that time, like, oh, we're gonna have a game here, and we didn't. But yeah, I remember like uh, someone went after me on Twitter for a
Uh-oh.
line and the note of a note about that like 4 point play at the end of the half. That was like, we must have been watching a different game because I saw Big Brother dunking Little Brother's head for an entire game. It's like we must have been watching a different game because I saw a 1 point game with 8 minutes left in the first half. But that was me
No, and
getting
that's,
off topic to air out my grievances with annoying people on Twitter. But no,
as you should, as you should. I'm here to support you through all of that. I yeah, no, to say that they dominated from, start to finish would probably not be true. Now, if you say they dominated throughout the last 30 minutes of that game, have at it by all means. But no, Nebraska did, a heck of a job staying in there for the first 10 minutes. Rode Tominaga's early buckets. He hit that step back over Trey, and it was like, buddy, that's kind of what got him going. And then he had the three right after, I believe, and the crowd got
yeah,
into it as much as they had all day. And so, I think a part of that is what kept Nebraska in it. Obviously, if you can ride that momentum behind your, star player, I mean, you're gonna throw some blows. You're gonna land some. And that's kind of what they did. And then yeah, it was just kind of where you down were better through 40 minutes. And that's kind of how Creighton pulled away with this one. I thought it was so interesting that they tied the largest margin of victory of all time. Like that's nuts to me. Since what, like 35 or something like that, like way, 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 way back. Like pushing a century. I mean, that's nuts. Tells you how close this series has been at times, and at the same time tells you how good Creighton was on Sunday slash how historically bad of a day from the field that was for the Huskers.
yeah. From a Creighton perspective, beyond just the simple, they made a lot of 3 pointers. Baylor
Hmm.
Shireman caught fire. How was Creighton able to dominate as thoroughly as it did?
Yeah, you had mentioned Ryan Kalkbrenner, and we had talked about it a little bit ago that you can't go 9% from three and have your big man go 3 for 11. That's just not a recipe for success. And Ryan Kalkbrenner, from my understanding, was sick in this matchup a year ago. Didn't play very much, and the minutes that he was on the floor, he was like 30% of the Ryan Kalkbrenner we saw Sunday. And so I think that was obviously a big help is, he finished with 3 blocks. You get one to go, and then you start having everybody who drives into the paint thinking, ah, where's 11? So that's one of the things. I think that really did it too. And as you would kind of mention, force Nebraska to kind of air it out from deep. And then obviously the circumstances, once it starts to snowball, you mentally think like, man, we can't get back into the shooting twos. So that played a little bit of part, but I think early on, until Nebraska was forced to kind of go in that do or die mode, we saw the difference that Ryan Kalkbrenner can make around the rim, and how even shots. I think Greg McDermott talked about this after the game. Even shots that he does not get a hand on, even shots that he is not primarily blocking, he's affecting them. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. So I thought that played a pretty big part, because credit to Nebraska's defense, or Creighton's defense on Nebraska in again those last 8 minutes of the first half. Because yes, Nebraska had a very bad day from the field, but I think we'd kind of be nuts to assume that Creighton didn't have something to do with that, albeit maybe about half of those looks, half of Nebraska's 22 looks were what I would consider good shots, and then they just missed them. But Creighton obviously had a big deal to do with that defensively as well, I think.
Yeah, I thought McDermott said something really interesting after the game. That was he said I think his exact words were, they took the 3-point shots we wanted them to take.
Hmm.
And you go back, the box score, look at the tape, it airs that out. They were there were times they were just they knew who to help off of, they knew who to sag off of, and I wrote this, Josiah Alec, who brings a lot to the table for Nebraska, is a career 29% 3-point shooter. Tominaga is
Yeah,
a career 40% 3-point shooter, and they took the same, they each took 4 3-pointers. Bryce Williams is a great 3-point shooter. He shot more than 39% basically every season of his career. He didn't attempt a 3-pointer. Jamarcus Lawrence and Boogie Coleman, who are both solid but not great from deep, they did. So thought that was an interesting point, that they knew who they could help off of. They knew who they could sag off of, to help, Kalkbrenner just make life hard down low, because nothing was coming easy for Nebraska at the rim. And, it was kind of a calculated risk, because we have seen, Nebraska's role players make 3-pointers before. Alec has
yeah.
actually shot it fairly well this year on an admittedly low volume of attempts, but it was I thought that was an interesting point, that they knew who they wanted taking the shots and who they wanted to dare to beat them.
Oh, for sure. And you could kind of see that in the game plan. When I had mentioned that about half of those were what I'd consider good looks, good shots. That does not necessarily mean that those are the people. My cat Ovi is here, so this is Ovi's introduction to the pod, I guess. But no, those open looks, albeit open, were probably not from the people that Nebraska wanted them to be from. And that was one of the biggest things for me, because yeah, calculated risk would be a really, really good way to put this, because they leave the guys open who they did. For example, Lawrence, for example, Alec, for example, Wilcher, um, if they hit a couple of those early, we'd have a game, I would
Yeah.
think, because then Nebraska has momentum, and they're like, oh, now we have to guard Lawrence, Wilcher, Alec. They'd have to reallocate kind of their defensive plan, and that would open things up for guys like Bryce Williams and Tominaga and Mast, and it's kind of I don't know, one gear gets going and the rest of them spin type of thing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I thought the Jays put a cog in one of those gears, and that did it essentially, as we kind of saw.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think people are probably going to look at Sunday and be like, man, they shot, the Jays shot 46% from the field and 35% from deep, and they assisted on more than half of their baskets. But all of those things aside, I thought they had a pretty good defensive plan as well, which could have come back to bite them, as I just kind of mentioned. But it didn't Sunday. So
Yeah. I think we saw, kind of the like the best case scenario for Creighton and the worst case
yeah,
scenario for Nebraska. It's hard for me to imagine if you play that game 10 times, the other nine are by more than 29 points, which isn't to say,
yeah,
Creighton still kind of left some on the table in the second half,
yeah.
like they had some open looks that didn't go down, but I think I think that was about, as bad as you could have seen it get from a Nebraska perspective, just on the
Oh, for
scoreboard.
sure. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Those so Creighton. That's funny that you said that because Creighton was 4-17 from deep after the second half. Nebraska was 1 for 12. So anybody keeping track at home, they went a combined 5 for 29 from beyond the arc. That that is interesting basketball to say the least.
Yeah. Before we move on, looking ahead to the next week, John, do you have any final thoughts on that Creighton Nebraska game before we put it to bed?
No, just kind of like I think you hit it dead on when you said, if this game's played 10 more times, it'd be hard to believe that Creighton wins by 29 plus, again. Because it'd be hard to believe that Nebraska would go 2 for 22 from beyond the arc every time and 33% from the field. Um, yeah, I just that is kind of spot on. I think Ryan Kalkbrenner, year to year, looking back at last year's game and then obviously taking in Sunday, I think Ryan Kalkbrenner's impact in his presence might have been understated last year. Granted, I wasn't here, obviously, so I just kind of going off of what I've heard so far, and I went back and watched that game a little bit. I think his lack of presence last year because he was sick might have been a little understated and what that meant for Creighton. And we kind of saw what a healthy Ryan Kalkbrenner can do for this Jays team, specifically against Nebraska. That was those were really my kind of big takeaways. But yeah, I'd love to see. Obviously, this is not how it works, but I would have loved to have seen this game go back and forth if Nebraska had hit shots early and stayed in a rhythm and rode that crowd. But I guess we'll never know.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. The atmosphere there is fantastic. But
Yeah.
the Nebraska brought out the big guns. They don't usually have the fire shooting out of the I don't know what you call those, but whatever. The starting lineups do not usually involve fire. They broke that out special for Creighton the other day.
Yeah. So yeah, do they use those like once they get into Big Ten play, or
I
are
don't know. I
those
guess I
like
mean
footballs that they use, or
it's a good question. I mean this is my first year on this beat too, but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I don't know. I guess we'll find out. I'm certainly not opposed to more fire in sporting events, but so yeah, big thumbs up on the fire. Final thought from that Creighton Nebraska game. Um,
We got a big week ahead for the Huskers. Maybe not so much for Creighton, but one of these two teams is going to have a pretty good opportunity to bounce back in what I think would be a pair of marquee wins.
yeah,
I think.
I mean certainly Michigan State on Sunday. You beat Michigan State, you beat Tom Izzo. I don't care what time of the year it is, or I don't care if we're still a couple months away from Michigan State turning it on like they always do. in like February, so they're hitting their stride by mid-March. But yeah,
Yeah.
they got a big chance against a very talented Michigan State team, and then a few days before that, tomorrow night they'll be in Minnesota, and Minnesota has not been that great the past couple of years, but Big Ten road wins don't grow on trees, and they don't come.
Yeah.
They're never gonna come. They're never gonna come easily. They're rarely gonna come easily when you're on the road. So yeah, Nebraska has a good chance to kind of take a feel good, take a nice positive step forward, pick up a road win uh tomorrow night.
Yeah, I think this is I'm looking ahead a little bit here. But I was covering the Big 12 before this, before I joined the Creighton beat, and I find it really interesting that the Big 10 does like pre-Christmas um conference games. I thought that was really interesting because like I said, I was at Oklahoma State. They won't play their first conference opponent until like January 2nd or something like that. And that's how that's how the entire Big 12 is.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's super interesting that you'll get a conference game, two of them at that, this early in the season. But I think at least as you said in the Michigan State instance, it's going to help Nebraska because you do not want to play Michigan State in closer to tournament time. Because what do they play? This is their only Michigan State matchup this year. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
You figure,
So
yeah, they
you
don't they
know,
don't go to East Lansing. Yeah,
yeah. So to be able to get them, in at home, um, I presume with more fire involved to your delight. Um, it's that's good for the Huskers, I think. But I
it,
mentioned kind of looking ahead a little bit that this is a brutal 3 game stretch
yeah,
before you kind of dismiss for Christmas break. At Minnesota, host Michigan State, and then you hit the road to play K State. This is a pretty big 3 game stretch for the Huskers. I think, anyways. Outside look,
yeah. Probably the three best teams they'll have played to that point outside of Creighton. Yeah, Nebraska did not have an especially hard schedule in the first 7 games. Duquesne was probably the best team they played before Creighton. I think the net like bears that out. I think Duquesne was their only non-quad four opponent. That just came out yesterday. So yeah, now it just they got kind of punched in the mouth by Creighton the other day, and now three opponents that I don't think are as talented as the Jays, but maybe Michigan State, depending on your opinion or perspective. But yeah, it gets a lot tougher from here on out. I think that starts with it starts with Minnesota. Nebraska also hasn't played a true road game this year. They had a neutral site against Oregon State, but that was a Nebraska home game. It was 3 hours away from here. It was loud in favor of Nebraska. So a lot for Nebraska to take on in a kind of short period of time.
yeah, and what? So that's 3 games, 11 days, two Big Ten opponents, Kansas State. That'll. I think we'll learn a lot about Nebraska. Obviously, it's only December, but I think we'll learn a lot about the Huskers. They kind of dismiss for the holiday,
Yeah.
because then they'll get North Dakota State on the 20th, and then South Carolina State on the 29th.
Yeah.
So, those will be two what should be softballs to get you kind of into the new year. But these upcoming 3 are going to be pretty important.
Yeah.
Probably not as important. I don't think any of these. I don't think Creighton's lone game this week is anywhere close to as important as what Nebraska has coming up.
Yeah. I would say you're right about that. I think
Central Michigan, come on now, big threat.
think Creighton should take care of business against Central Michigan unless I don't know, unless
I
the
don't
Chips
know.
have some tricks up their sleeves.
Yeah,
But saw something that really stood out on film.
Yeah, I don't, I don't know. I scouted Central Michigan a little bit yesterday, and I was just like, oh man, they have not played anybody crazy so far this year. They're 2-5. They're 1-3 on the road. I mean, they just have not been, a crazy good basketball team. Um, got blown out by Florida State, lost by 10 to Stetson, got blown out by Ohio State. So yeah, it's tough to see Central Michigan coming into CHI on Saturday and making noise. But that's the beauty of college basketball, is I'm sure that nobody expected Colorado State to do that either. And they kind of throttled the Jays, right? Well, granted, I think Colorado State, as we've seen since then, is probably going to be one of the better teams in the country,
Yeah,
which is so weird to say. But
certainly. I
credit,
think one of the best mid majors. One of the best
yeah,
non Power Six.
yeah, absolutely. And so, we didn't know that when they beat Creighton, but we know it now. I don't think Central Michigan is anywhere close to that same caliber in terms of a mid major. But it's college basketball, man. Who knows?
Yeah, I think with that, that's a good final thought. It's college basketball, man. John, anything else from you before we sign off for the week?
No, I appreciate you for helping me get around Lincoln on Sunday. I appreciate all the love everybody's shown over my first week in Omaha. But no, let's ball. That's
All
it.
right.
Those are my parting words. Let's ball.
All right. Yeah, let's ball and let's also subscribe to and read the Omaha World-Herald. Thank you everyone for listening. This has been the Half Court Press Podcast.